Now then, anybody think of any other business we've overlooked? Otherwise, we're gonna move on to the program.
Move on.
All right. I'd like to introduce tonight our speaker, who is going to be Lara Grant,
If you pronounce it right.
a graduate of Lawrence University who majored in history and has I think it's a hobby of
Obsession?
genealogy and cemetery. So this is a combined love. She knows what she's talking about because she has a degree, and she likes to talk about it because she's very interested in the subject. So without further ado then, I'd like to introduce Lara, who will tell you something about what she's going to be talking about tonight.
Okay, let's see if we can turn this thing on. And I will grab the mic. Sneak up here.
You need to have the lights.
Yes, I need the lights off. Nobody's scared of the dark. Me- Yeah, actually,
Is that okay to leave that? There is,
Yeah, but I
we
think
can
that's
get less
Too
light
far
than
that
that.
way, it's heavy.
I got it.
Over
I got
by
it.
you is
Yep, we're good.
this back. There you go.
you know what?
Now we can turn off.
Yeah, let's turn it.
There's it.
Pause. Okay, you don't have to see me, you just have to hear me. My name is Lara Grant. I worked out at Rip and Drug. You may have seen me in the frame shop. But I'm also a board member of the Historical Society, and they asked me to give the program on cemeteries since I'm kind of obsessed with cemeteries. So I'm going to start out basically talking about the sort of the history of how the gravestone art started, and then I'll go into what some of the stone symbols mean with Ripon people as the focus. So, since I was young, I spent quite a bit of time in cemeteries, especially in the last 5 years, doing redocumentation of the 6 cemeteries in Ripon. I tend to like hanging out with dead people, sometimes more than live ones. The dead listen when I say excuse me and sorry if I step on their stones, and they don't complain. Loving anything to do with genealogy, I like to look at the words and dates and images on the stones. I know some people think that spending time in cemeteries for fun is kind of weird. Then, while doing research for this program, I came across a term that made me smile. I learned what I am. I'm a taphophile. I'm not that weird after all. Taphophilia is a passion for gravestones, their artwork, and epitaphs in cemeteries in general. Have you ever walked through a cemetery and wondered what the carvings on the stones meant? Why does the lady who lies at the end of the row, who died at 38, have a wilted rose on her stone? What does the willow tree mean on the stone of the 67-year-old man buried in the first row? Why are there skulls on the oldest stones but angels on the later ones in the colonial cemetery that great-great-grandpa's buried in Massachusetts? Over the last 400 years, attitudes towards death have evolved as attitudes towards religion has changed. This evolution can be seen on the images of gravestones in America. Excuse me. In the early 1600s, the quest for monetary gain and religious persecution drove thousands from their European homelands to the New World. Those who went to Tidewater, Virginia's Jamestown, buried their dead quickly to hide the losses from the nearby Indians. Most were buried at night within the palisade walls. Those are the ones who were buried that they found graves for. And 22 of these graves were recently discovered by archaeologists. Okay. And they're marked with simple crosses. One grave had a gabled lid, and it was found outside the palisade walls. It was believed that this grave belonged to Captain Gosnell, who was the captain of the Godspeed. His remains are now, that's him, are now in the nearby museum. And yes, he is there. Once the English colonies were well established in the Tidewater area, the status of the deceased was more important in marking the grave. In this area, one can find coats of arms, or more just written about the person with the family connections, wife of, son of, daughter of, etc. Not a lot of artwork, just a lot of words. This one's for a female stranger, someone who just was new to town, died, and her husband buried her and left. Nobody knew what her name was. You don't see much else on the stones down south till later in the 19th century. Now in New England, the first pilgrim burials near Plymouth were done similarly to those at Jamestown. They were done at night to hide the dwindling numbers. Sorry to how small this picture is, that's the biggest I could get it. They used Coles Hill, which is basically right there. And it's right across the street from where Plymouth Rock is, if you've ever been to Plymouth. Between 1620 and 1637, they used Coles Hill before moving to Burial Hill, which is just north of downtown, or up the hill from downtown. Let's see, 10 years later, the first pilgrims landed. Now, after the first pilgrims landed, the Puritans began to settle towards Boston. Unlike their pilgrim neighbors who wanted separation from the Anglican Church, Puritans wanted to purify the church of its popish ways. Puritans had this belief that only a select few would attain heaven. The rest would be born, live, die, then rot. The early stonemakers had no images on them, put no images on them at all. This is actually still on Burial Hill. Here we go. They just had names and dates. And that one, I had to get a side view of this one. It says David Ashley.
Were some of those stones restored?
No,
That they still are that?
that's the type of stone they use out there. It's very, very easily readable now. Okay. Then after 1650, the attitude towards death could be seen sort of in pictures, also in words on the gravestones. Images were meant as a teaching tool, since not a lot of people could read. Death was an inevitable part of life, and as it was ingrained into everyone in the community, from children to the elderly, along with the usual names, dates of birth and dates of death, commonly shown were images of memento mori, which is remember you're going to die. You see skull and crossbones. There's an hourglass right here. There's a coffin right here. Let's see. They told the viewer that time was fleeting and to remember that being ready for death at any time was important. One image that was common was that of the death head. That's a death head. The death head is a truly Puritan creation. The head, usually seen in skull form or as the infamous skull and crossbones, is sometimes accompanied by an hourglass or miniature coffin. Everyone would end up like the skull in the stone. The epitaph, "Here lies the body of," usually accompanied these images. Basically, the meaning was, here was a person, he lived, he died, good night. The most common epitaph at the time was a variation of the following: "Stranger, stop and cast an eye. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so will you be. Prepare for death and follow me." That's another. And then there's this one. "Death is a debt to nature due, as I have paid, and so must you." Later in the 1600s, the Puritan grip in the region relaxed a bit. This was reflected in the images on the stones. The death head sprouted wings, still meaning that life was fleeting, but there was a glimmer of hope. The body may go the way of dust, but the soul had a possibility of attaining a higher or lower realm. As time passed, the death heads continued to evolve. This one's actually one of my relatives. This can be seen in the death heads of West Springfield and Hadley, Massachusetts. The stone carvers, John Ely, Joseph Williston, and the Stebbins family adjusted their carving style over time. This one's an Ely. and so are those. Now, you gotta wonder why there's no nose. I found out why there's no nose. They actually carved the stone, and the stone may be really, really legible, but Massachusetts now has forbidden gravestone rubbings because the stones are fragile. They may have damage on the inside that you can't see from the outside. You push against it and it'll go. So usually the noses were the first things to fall off. They get a little bit more intricate the later on you get. The change from death, later when you do all these, the death head actually changed its name to a soul effigy. Soul effigies could be timed fairly accurate with the religious strictures of a particular area. The skull became a face, albeit with a vacant stare, like that one. Let's see. And here lies the body of was replaced with here lies the mortal remains of, increasing the idea of the soul. The deceased was no longer considered just food for worms, but his or her soul would go to a higher or lower plane. Later, the vacant stare. These are kind of weird. Showed more human emotion, and then later, like in the early 1800s, you get ones that actually look like people. That's a lady right here. That's her husband's stone. Yeah. Okay. Now, references to the corruptible body were completely replaced by flowery phrases such as sacred to the memory and gone but not forgotten. Once the Puritan hold in the area was gone, and religion became more intellectual and more questioning, a new image began to infiltrate the rows of soul effigies in the graveyard. The artwork reflected this more neoclassic attitude. Simple designs of the sun, rising or setting. And this one, you really can't tell if it's rising or setting. Either way. And then you get the willows. And then with urns. Symbolize the remains of the deceased and sorrow for the loss of the earthly life. Virtually took over as images in the gravestones in the mid-1800s. All around this time, the stones and stone carving became more modernized. Sandstone gave way to marble, then to granite. The images were sandblasted under the stone rather than carved exclusively by hand. Now this one's actually in the hillside. You got the willow here, and then you get the urn. Okay. Now in the 1840s, the land surrounding the present Ripon area was open for pioneer settlement. Anson Dart, that's Anson Dart, and his son Richard, were asked to look over the lands owned by Governor John Scott Horner near the mill pond, where the mill pond is now. The Darts had property south of Green Lake. Now, Anson died in 1879 in Washington, D.C., but his wife and his two sons, Richard and Charles, are buried in Hillside. There's Richard. And there's his wife Eliza. In 1844, the Wisconsin Phalanx held the parcel of land called Ceresco in what's now the western section of Ripon. Woodlawn Cemetery was open on a 5-acre piece of property donated for a burial ground. The land was part of the farm owned by Robert Mason and his wife, Cynthia. And they had Cynthia's mother living with them. Now, interesting story about Lois here is she is the daughter of a Revolutionary War soldier and a wife of another Revolutionary War soldier. The first burial, they died within 2 weeks of each other.
Oh, they did.
Mm-hmm. Cynthia died first, and then Lois died soon thereafter. The first burial in Woodlawn was that of Albert Farman, son of Uriel Farman. The grave doesn't have a permanent marker that anybody's found, so we're not quite sure where in the cemetery he's buried. Other early Ceresco families who stayed in the area and buried in Woodlawn include the Masons, the Limberts, that's George, and there's his wife, and I can't read the wife's. Then you have the Millers, and the Porters, and the Wrights, and the Woodruffs. Now William Starr, and he's buried in Hillside, he was Ceresco's second postmaster, and he's buried with his wife up the hill. Okay. In 1849, David Mapes and John Scott Horner founded the settlement of Ripon up the hill from Ceresco. Hillside Cemetery was opened in the early 1850s. The first death in Ripon is believed to have been that of Hattie Mapes, daughter-in-law of David Mapes, who was buried on the hill on the current college campus. But when her remains were then reinterred in Hillside. Outside the current city limits, there were several smaller cemeteries, including Loper, up near CJ's by the wayside, Bethel Reed's Corner, which is between Brandon and Ripon in the township of Matoma, St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cemetery on the old road to Green Lake, and several small burial grounds now on private property just over the Green Lake County line, Mitchell's Glen, Burdick, and Bone Steel are just a few of those. While looking at the stones of the founders of the prominent families of Ripon, though, I noticed they didn't have a lot of artwork. They basically had very large pillars and words. That's it. Of the founding generation, most of them are in Hillside, though. David P. Mapes has 2 stones. That's his original. That's the new one. John Scott Horner and his wife Harriet are buried in section A, along with Harriet's sister Olivia, and they have crosses. And then John Scott Horner has a plaque that the DAR chapter put down, just describing what he did for the community. Okay, William Brockway was one of the founders of Brockway, later Ripon College, and he's buried along with his siblings, including Edward P. Brockway and his mother, in a plot near the American Legion flagpole. Now, there's no known pictures of William, but that's his brother Edward. Now, Alan Beauvais is buried in New York, but he was instrumental in the founding of the Republican Party at the Little White Schoolhouse in 1854. Other men attended that meeting were Jedediah Bowen, who was a native of Wales, and it says where he was born on his tombstone. And those are his kids. And you get Amos Loper, who's buried in Loper Cemetery, Abram Thomas, and Jacob Woodrow. Other early settlers included Henry Toombs, William Light, A.G. Kellogg, and this is A.G.'s first wife, Juliet. There's Asa Hill and his stone, and Asa's wife, Felina. And then the Pedricks and their families. They were soon followed by the Runnels, the Bowens, and David Greenway and family. After the villages of Ceresco and Ripon officially became the city of Ripon on March 20th, 1858, the new city officers were elected. Harvey Grant, and he's no relation to me, became the first mayor. This is the family stone for him. There's names on each side of that pillar. That's Harvey's stone, or what's left of it. S.C. Dodge became the first treasurer, G.B. Cooley was the first superintendent of schools, and D.Y. Sabin was the first assessor. All except Sabin, who died in Kansas, are now permanently reside in Hillside, as do Sabin's parents, the Reverend Daniel Sabin and Clarissa, and his wife Hattie. Other prominent Riponites buried in Hillside include Edward Merrill, the president of Ripon College, Timothy Mapes, son of D.P. Mapes, an early newspaper editor. It's his stone. Clarissa Tucker Tracy, matron of Ripon College and professor of algebra and botany. George Field, who's the cashier at the Ripon State Bank and deacon of the St. Peter's Episcopal Church. Now there's several pictures of his stone because it's huge. Yeah, now that's the family stone. That's his. And then I decided to get pictures of each part of the big stone. Okay. J.W. Walcott was an early Ripon College leader. That's his stone. It's his wife, Caroline Cooper. And then Caroline's parents, Isaac and Azuba. Then you get E.J. and Martha Selfridge Smith, who were the aunt and uncle of Gordon Selfridge of Marshall Fields and Selfridges of London fame.
Lara, is
Yeah.
there the Selfridge tombstone there?
No, there are no Selfridge tombstones.
Okay.
The family moved out of town, but Martha stayed. She's the only one who stayed.
Is the park named from them?
Yes. And then you get Pitt Cody, who was Hattie Sabin's father.
I noticed that Martha kept, her maiden name was on the stone.
Yeah, a lot of the maiden names end up on the stones, which is nice. There's Pitt Stone.
Yeah.
And his wife, Phoebe Bissell Cody. And get the maiden name on there too. And then you get the Burlingame family. This is Mary. This is Aunt Jane, according to the back of the picture. Don't know who Aunt Jane is, but. And this is Sam. That's his stone. And that's the plot. They had a huge amount of children, and a lot of them died young. Now, as with earlier centuries, the 19th century was a time when the image carried great meaning, especially when a large percentage of the population was illiterate. Images on gravestones also held significant meaning. Flowers and animals on gravestones each meant something specific, whether about the deceased or about life in general. Floral tributes became very prevalent. Buds of any flower, but mainly those of roses, meant life was fragile. Used on the graves of children or young people, they signify a short life. If the image had a broken stem, it meant that life was cut short. Now, the lily of the valley is commonly used in the graves of children as well, where it represents innocence and purity. The flowers also signified rebirth and renewal. Like the lily of the valley, the daffodil has a dual meaning. One, like the lily, is that of rebirth and resurrection, since the flower is seen each spring after a long winter. The second meaning was that of vanity, being a bright and showy flower. In the cemetery, the rebirth excuse is more common. The evening primrose also has several meanings: eternal love, memory, hope, and sadness. Victory over death was one of the meanings of the laurel wreath in the 19th century gravestones. The leaves of the laurel do not wilt or fade, and this led to the meaning of immortality, while the victory came from the use of the wreath in Roman times, where it was bestowed on the victor of a contest. And that's that one right here. The poppy was and still is the flower that represents remembrance, especially after World War One. The Easter lily represented purity and chastity. It signified the casting away of earthly things and attaining heavenly qualities, usually found on the. Sorry, gotta go through these first. That's down one here. Okay. Usually found on the graves of women, the rose signified beauty and motherhood. Now this is Maria Bailey. She's buried over in the Western Addition in Hillside. That's her stone. The rose in full bloom meant the deceased had a full life. If the woman died young, as many did in childbirth, a broken stem was sometimes depicted. Okay, other flowers that can be seen in the cemetery are the aster and the morning glory. Now, flowers weren't the only plants that were used on gravestones. You have fern leaves in there. The fern on the stone signified humility, frankness, and sincerity. A cluster of grapes, with or without leaves, represented the Holy Communion, and sometimes is shown with wheat. Ivy, a plant that never dies off, meant immortality, fidelity, and friendship. A sheaf of wheat on a gravestone signified a long and fruitful life. And that is a sheaf of wheat. Trees also played a significant role on gravestone images. The oak tree and its leaves and acorns represented fruitfulness, prosperity, strength, and endurance. Now, the palm leaf signified life over death. The willow tree, a holdover from the 18th century, continued to signify grief and sorrow. In the 19th century, it also represented immortality, since the tree could continue to survive even if its branches were cut off. This stone is the oldest stone I found in the area. 1847 is when Ira Pierce died. And this is over at Reed's Corner. This is Lois Hitchcock's brother, Ebenezer.
About those stones on A that are in that.
In the cornfield, that's
Yeah.
bone steel. That one I haven't had a chance to go up into yet. You have to get permission of the farmer. When they're on private land, it's best to ask for permission. Because sometimes they won't let you on.
You know the significance of the hand?
Yeah. The hand's going to get explained in a little bit. Let's see here. Now, the pine cone also represented immortality, and as it is the seed of the pine tree. I don't know if I have a picture of a pine cone or not. That one's from out east. That means life cut short. What do you think? Now, tree stones were popular in the Midwest from the 1880s to about 1910, when they were sold in the Sears Roebuck Company catalog. Now, they can be full of meaning. If the tree was cut off, it meant that the life was cut short. Sometimes the tree was the family stone, and stumps were used for individual members. The stones were also used for members of woodmen of the world. Now, images of animals also had meaning on gravestones. The lamb is a common image on the gravestones of children. It represented innocence and purity. That one is right here. Some of these stones are really hard to read anyway. I didn't want to do a rubbing because I didn't want to mess it up. And that one is right in here. Another image that signified innocence was the dove. It can be seen in several poses and sometimes holding a branch. I like this one. Little dead bird. Now this one is really, really hard to see. It's actually, the tail's up here and it's swooping down. And it's holding, it looks like there's roses down here. But you can just make out the wings here and the tail up there. Then sometimes other birds can include the deceased's favorite, such as the cardinal or an owl. And that was another memento mori type symbol. Sometimes the image of a shell can be found on the stones. The scallop shell signified a journey or pilgrimage of the deceased to the other realm. In modern times, favorite animal of the deceased was sometimes carved onto the stone or added to it. Like if you see dogs or deer or something like that as well. Now, images other than flowers and plants and animals are common in 19th century cemeteries. Hands played a very large role in 19th century gravestones. The hand pointing up towards heaven signifies that the soul has risen to heaven. Now that one, the hand is actually right here. It's a hand, a book, a crown, a heart, and a lamb. They pretty much had everything on that one.
Do they normally, when it breaks, do they normally just set it on top? Or-
It varies.
It does?
It depends on the cemetery. I found a lot of stones in it, and you'll see one later on that is actually the original stone of a War of 1812 veteran, and you can't read it anymore. It's basically just dust. But it's still right, that you can see where it was.
Okay.
But it depends on if people take the time to pick it up. Because there are stones in Hillside that there's no saving them. They're gone. And I talked to a cousin of mine the other night, and she said our great-great-grandfather's stone in New York, we had found it, we took a picture of it, she went back this fall, it's gone. It's just, disintegrated completely. So. Now, hands pointing down doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go to the other place. But it also is a calling, God calling the deceased home. Now, two hands shaking, with the cuffs of the sleeves depicting a man and the woman's meant matrimony. And you can see the difference in the cuffs here. If they were sort of gender neutral, it could signify that it was either an earthly farewell or a heavenly welcome. Now this stone is a little bit different use of the hand. Now the hand is right here, that's the thumb, the fingers, and the wrist is right here. It's holding a pen, and there's a piece of paper. This is the stone of C.J. Allen, who was the editor of one of the early Ripon newspapers. in the 1850s until he died in 1862. This stone is actually fallen in half. So this is the top of it, leaning up against the back of the bottom of it. The hand's holding a pen and about to write on a blank piece of paper, as he did through his occupation. Now, angels were very popular gravestone art from the mid to late 19th century and took various forms. When seen on the graves of children, they represented innocence. Sometimes they were carved into the face of the stone, and sometimes they were the stone itself. Now, also seen on the graves of children were depictions of the child himself sleeping or sitting in a scallop shell. The sleeping figure represented eternal rest, while the shell, as mentioned previously, represented the journey to the other side. Non-living images can also be seen in 19th century gravestones. The anchor represented hope. And the anchor on this one is right there. The ships could either mean the deceased lived a seafaring life or show the journey of the deceased to the other side. Books took several forms. The closed book meant a completed life, while an open book showed the deceased's life open to God. Sometimes the book was the Bible, especially if the deceased was a minister. Now, gateways or arches showed the barrier to the other realm and were commonly seen as open, leading the deceased to the other side. We'll get back to Aaron in a little bit. I'll explain him in a little bit. I'll get into that. Curtains could be seen as a veil to the other side, but also help the deceased feel that they were at home, like furniture. Curtains over urns could be seen as reverential to the deceased, or mainly as decorative items. An empty chair, or sometimes a pair of shoes, represented the death of a loved one, usually, but not always, that of a young person.
Is that in Ripon Cemetery now?
That one? No, this one's
I
not.
think so.
This one, I believe, is in St. Louis. I got that one from a book. But this one's in Woodlawn. And these are in Hillside. A broken column or partially carved stone usually meant a life cut short. Now, one image only seen on gravestones is that of the inverted torch. If the torch was lit, it represented the death in general, but if it was unlit, it meant either the life being extinguished or the end of the family line with the death of the last male in the family. Another similar image is that of the wheel. A broken wheel cannot turn and represented a life that was ended. A full wheel, as in this stone wheel, could either represent the main occupation of the family or, I'm not quite sure. It's sort of a wheel looking thing. Looks like a millstone. There are several types of images on gravestones that relate to activities of the deceased. Some reflect the occupation or interest. Planes could represent either a life in the Air Corps or as a pilot. Now this one's in Woodlawn. Trains could either mean a life as an engineer or a railroad man, or sometimes as a model railway hobbyist. This one I think is also in St. Louis.
Is that concrete?
That's stone. It was a black and white picture. Okay, then you get the farm implements. You get tractors and stuff like that. Usually these were usually farmers. And this is actually of a painting about farming.
Yeah.
Can't remember who the artist is, but I've seen it recently. There are also musical instruments. And people who enjoyed hunting either have a deer or other wild animals on their stones. Now, graves of priests usually have a cross on them. Then there are the odd stones, geometric shapes. They can be just stones. Or the carvings can sometimes depict local landmarks, such as the end of the trail.
Lara, that
Yeah.
stone
Right near you.
is part of Alan Hargrave's family.
Is it?
Yes.
Okay.
He was a member here for many years.
Now, some images and metal markers that are adjacent to the gravestones represent organizations that the deceased had affiliation with. If the deceased was a nurse, you might find a Registered Nurses of America marker. Images of several veterans organizations are also frequently seen. You get the American Legion and the Auxiliary. But this is the back of one of the Legion markers that I found. The VFW, the Grand Army of the Republic, that's the Civil War group, the Women's Relief Corps. Then you have specific ones to specific wars. This person was a Revolutionary War soldier, so the SAR put a marker up. This one's Civil War, right here. Spanish-American War. World War I is usually this one. They have a different symbol for the World War II ones. I just didn't have a picture of it. There's Persian Gulf. This one's a World War I. This one is Civil War. And sometimes you see ones with just flags and the unit that they were in. This is the Baileys. This is their son. Okay, now in Hillside and Woodlawn, there are many veterans of this country's wars. There are 4 veterans of the War of 1812. There's Joseph Hoyt, Elijah Steele, right here, and Walter Atwell, and Reverend Daniel Sabin. His picture was earlier. He was also an 1812 veteran. Now this is the new stone that the Atwells have. That's the original Walter's stone. That's all that's left of it. This is his wife, Clementina. Her stone's right next to it. Then you have, there are many, many children of Revolutionary War soldiers. William Mears Dawes was the son of William Dawes, who rode with Paul Revere. This is General Mason Brayman. He was a general in the Civil War. And you just make out his name here. Then you have the Uphams. Charles H. Upham was a captain and commissary of the Department of the Gulf during the Civil War. is his wife, Amanda, and her stone. I like it when they say where they're born. Now, this one is W.W. LaGrange. He's the brother of Oscar LaGrange. If you look over the copier over here, there's a picture of Oscar. Over here this way. Over by Todd. That's Oscar. That's his brother. Oscar's buried in New York, but that's his stone. And then this is Aaron Bailey, but Henry Eggleston is also a veteran of the Civil War. And this is the guy who got wounded by the tomahawk thrown by an Indian. I don't see a tomahawk wound. But it definitely says it on the bottom of his stone. Now there's Frank L. Anders. And he served in the Spanish-American War and in the Philippine insurrection. That's where he got the Congressional Medal of Honor. He got it for bravery when he and 11 others stormed the enemy line and routed 300. This is his son, Frank Oliver Anders. And he served in the Pacific Theater in World War II. He was captured at Bataan and survived the Bataan Death March and one of the POW camps. And he received the Silver Star. I don't have a picture, but we also have Mary's husband, William, over there. He has a bench over in the, is it section 1 of the West edition? It's on the north side of the cemetery along Congress Street.
I don't know the sections.
Yeah. Now, another type of symbol that can be found are those of lineage and fraternal societies to which the deceased belonged. Primary symbol of the Freemasons are the builder's square with a G in the center, representing either geometry or God. Depends on who you ask. That one's up here. This is Audrey Conant's in-laws. Now this one is a different one. This is the Masonic keystone. Now we have similar ones for Shriners, Order of Eastern Star. They also have the Knights Templar, Knights of Columbus, the Odd Fellows, the Elks. There's no Elks here as far as I know. This is also from out of state. The DAR. And they also have symbols of the ones from Mayflower. There's a lady up in Berlin who has a Mayflower symbol on her gravestone. Now, there are several families from the Ripon area that had interesting stones or stories. Louise Meade Higby was the daughter of Hiram and Albina Meade. When she married, she and her husband moved to New Orleans, where her husband died. This is a later picture of her. Louise returned to Ripon with her children, and they're buried here. Oops. Fast. Dennis Aiken was a druggist and ran a shoe business, as well as being city assessor and treasurer. His daughter Lavina was the first graduate of Ripon College's School of Music in 1872. A.B. Pratt was a deputy U.S. Marshal during the Civil War. The Everhard family had several generations of doctors. Dr. Frank graduated from Rush Medical School in 1887 and came out of retirement to be the physician at the college army camp at Ripon College during 1917-1918. He was married to Catherine Upham, daughter of C.H. and Amanda from back in the Civil War section. This is his sister, Elnora. She graduated from the University of Michigan Medical School in 1896 and was interested in public health work. Their father was Aaron, and he was also he was elected mayor 12 times of the city of Ripon. The Burr family came to Ripon relatively early. The family stones are quite interesting. The big family stone is that of Rodin's the Thinker. On the back of it, there's a quote by Ingersoll. Now this is a separate stone that's just leaning up against it, and I'm not sure if it was meant to do that, or if it was taken from another stone that's gone. This is Lester. He was a judge. I like his epitaph. The fools aren't all dead yet. And this is his wife, Dorothy. And this is Lester's sister, Charlotte. Yep. Okay, then there are the simple stones of Lafayette Pharaoh. And if you can barely read it, it's 1869 to 1919. And I apologize for the blurriness of the next one. That's the way it came out. Honest John Williams, Negro, died of old age, 1923. Now these stones are made of concrete and have names and dates. It looks like painted on them in white. For their age, they're still quite legible, except Honest John's stone is no longer accessible. It lies below a large pile of dirt and gravel near the college path in the lower part of Woods hillside, known in the past as the Potter's Field. He was a freed African American who came to Ripon and made his living as a ragman. There were several long obituaries about his death in 1923, and this was taken from the front page obituary of the Ripon newspaper. Now, as you take a walk through one of the local cemeteries, see what images you find. You can learn a lot about your ancestors by what they had on their gravestones. You can learn what they thought of religion and death in particular, and what they enjoyed doing during life, what their family thought of them after they died. Take, for instance, the gravestone of Warren Gibbs in Pelham, Massachusetts. Along with his name and age and date of death, it tells quite a story. Not only does the stone give the cause of his demise, but the 2-paragraph poem below explains how he died and the name of the person who ended his life. Now, it's hard to read in the picture, but I've got it here. Think, my friends, when this you see, how my wife hath dealt by me. She in some oysters did prepare, some poison for my lot and share. When of the same I did partake, and nature yielded to its fate, before she my wife became, Mary Felton was her name, erected by his brother William Gibbs. Warren's brother thought the story should not be forgotten, so he had the stone and its enthralling tale made. I have looked up Warren Gibbs. I can't find anything about his death.
What cemetery is that?
It's in Pelham, Massachusetts.
Oh, okay. Oh, shucks.
It's like, I want to go to Massachusetts just to see this stone now. The deceased can become more than just a name and a couple of dates. More importantly, they can be remembered by future generations, just as their 16th century ancestors had been. You never know who you may run into in the cemetery. You too may become a taphophile. Thank you.
Are you taking any questions?
I'll take questions if people have questions, sure.
I had just a little one.
Okay.
I just noticed a couple of the stones said Mrs. John Smith, and the others would say Mary Smith, and I don't, was there any
There's one.
significance?
It depends on who died first, I think.
Because I don't think I've seen too many Mrs.
There are a couple in Hillside.
Are there?
Yeah. There's a Mrs. I think it's George Buchholz, buried next to George Buchholz, and you don't know what her name is. It's like she had a name.
It's Mrs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
So it depends, and it depends actually where you are too. Over, for instance, in Scotland, they put maiden names. They don't do the married name; you do the maiden name, but you're all listed on the same stone. So,
Right, for research.
yeah.
Do you have, I mean, what's sort of happening recently? I mean, I don't recall too many people that put
They-
symbols on it,
It's too
even if they have
expensive.
stones.
It's too expensive.
boring now.
Yeah, I mean, they're all laser cut. When I was doing the walkthrough of Woodlawn a couple of years ago, there was actually a gravestone company came out and they were etching the dates into one of the stones, but they did it with a sandblaster type thing. but that stone didn't have any pictures on it. Because it cost at least when we tried to get the numbers on my grandma's stone, it was $25 a letter,
Yeah, it's
at least, and that was Vermont.
Have you made any observations relative to the ability of particular tombstone material to weather better than other types?
For mine, if I had the choice, I'd grab brownstone out of New England because that has held up for 400 years and it's still legible. But it depends on actually the weather conditions too. I mean, around here you get a lot of granite stones, but they have a lot of moss growing on them, which eats into the stone and it makes it deteriorate. So, I mean, it depends. The sandstones don't last very well.
No.
They
Imagine they were soft and so
marble's best. Yeah.
they were soft enough so you could etch them much easier.
Right.
And the granite I
now you
noticed
get the granite, so
had
they're better.
lichen and other
Yeah.
forms of plant life growing
Right.
on them.
You just have to make sure you keep them clean. A stiff brush and just water. That's all you use on a stone, just water.
I often wonder about the demise of cemeteries, you know, how many centuries they will be there. Back a few years, there were whispers about, well, the private ones in Milwaukee, they were reburying people
Mhm.
on top, you know, destroying evidence of the old graves.
Well, they do that in Scotland though, because they have a lot of, my dad's family's from there, and we went over to visit. And we found my great-grandfather's grave, and I was there, it was the first time anybody from our family, after they emigrated, had been back. And it's like, you want to just cry.
It's just not
But-
terribly long ago that in Paris, they had to remove a
Yeah.
great many from a cemetery
Yeah.
so that they could continue to use it.
But in Scotland, what they do over there is they'll dig a hole two coffins deep. You have pine box, nothing else, none of the entombment stuff, and there's enough room for two top on top of each other. By the time the next person number 3 goes in, number 1 is squashed.
Sure.
My great grandfather's grave has both of his parents, him, 2 other brothers, and a sister-in-law. There are 6 people in one slot.
Well, isn't it down in, is it New Orleans too?
They're all above
Where
ground.
they
Yeah.
disintegrate and then they just add
Yeah.
people.
Well, in Germany, you lease your plot, and you lease it for a 50-year time. If no one's around in 50 years to pay it, they'll take the stone down, toss it up against a wall, and somebody else goes in.
That's why the popularity.
I've always been curious about these. I call them the Tootsie Roll stones. Do you have any views on that? Do you know what
I
I mean?
haven't seen anything.
Well, they're
Oh,
in
yes.
there. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
They look like a Tootsie
Well,
Roll.
I haven't seen anything written about them, why
Okay.
they're in that
Yeah,
shape,
'cause
but
They
I've
always
seen
seem
those,
to
yeah.
be red.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
red.
red granite, yeah.
So I'm curious to know. if-
Lara, have you visited that little cemetery on Highway 49, about 3 miles out of town?
49.
Or is it on?
So,
Oh, towards Brandon, that's Reed's Corner.
Oh, there's a little cemetery.
No,
Where am I
somebody was
thinking of
here
it?
and they were looking for that.
Yeah,
They-
that,
When I did the thing on
and
the
the teachers
teachers.
too, what
Yeah, I
was
guess
the
they
name
had
of
trouble
that
finding.
farm?
It's not
Oh,
49.
Yeah, and those stones are
Some
gorgeous.
was off of 49.
Yeah.
Maybe it's Radio Road.
Radio Road, yeah, I've been
It's
to
a
that
little
one. It's
tiny
18, there's only 4
cemetery.
little stones there.
Yeah.
It's the Schwartz burying the, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I didn't take pictures there, but I basically very carefully parked my car off the side of the road there, 'cause it's a big ditch.
There's like about
Yeah.
12 graves there, maybe?
4,
Oh,
only 4.
Now, if you bury in a private plot like the one you were just speaking
Mhm.
of, do they have to make sure that they're contracted perpetual care or you're not?
You're not allowed anymore.
Oh.
I've heard a story of one lady who, her husband wanted to be buried on her property. She had to become a licensed undertaker to do it. So,
Sexton, not an undertaker.
well, I was told undertaker.
Oh,
when-
really?
yeah.
I believe it's Sexton.
Okay.
Be a lot of schooling.
Yeah, that's running out of land. I know some places they'll let you cremate, but they won't let you scatter. It's like, well, what's the point? So, I know my mom's teacher in high school, her husband, when he died, he wanted to be buried in the lake. So she had him cremated, they wouldn't allow it. She went out in a rowboat at midnight and scattered his ashes in the lake with nobody else watching.
Well, in the ABA, you know what happened, they took out all those formal gardens, but people that knew what happened there said, hey, just a minute, there were a lot of people's ashes spread in that area, in those gardens.
Oh, jeez.
So before the parking lot went in, they said, I'm sure they didn't want concrete on top of them. So they went, they took all of the topsoil off.
Oh,
Now,
wow.
where it is, I have no idea, but to please all these people, they scraped the whole thing.
Wow.
Where was that?
The
I thought you
ABA.
said the Tombstones.
Where the new dining room is?
Oh, the rubbings? Some states it's illegal. You can't do
That is
gravestone rubbings.
illegal now?
But some states made it illegal.
I've done a lot of that in Massachusetts.
You can't do it in Massachusetts anymore.
Made what?
You cannot do gravestone rubbings
Oh.
unless you get major permission from somebody, and I don't know who you'd ask.
Do they post it before you go into the cemetery that you can't do it?
I don't know, because the last time I was in a cemetery in Massachusetts was, back in '98, and I don't know if the law was in force then.
Oh.
But I know you can't do it in Massachusetts now. I'm gonna assume that yes, they'll have it posted somewhere
Yeah.
at this point, because if it's gonna damage the stones, they don't want that to happen. So,
Many of the stones that you showed were in bad shape. Who's
Yeah.
responsible for
the city
maintaining
is
them? Or the
responsible
city?
for those.
So no one else is allowed to maintain them?
Well, a lot of the damage that I've noticed from walking through Hillside and then going back and taking pictures for this, and I've noticed that some of the stones are like messed up or knocked over or something, that's the lawnmower doing it. Because you can
Well,
see,
it's
with the chips,
vandalism too.
well, there are some of them that it's definitely the lawnmower, because you see tire tracks. Because they take the riding lawnmower right through there, and,
They weren't designed for riding lawnmowers.
no, they were not designed for riding lawnmowers. But it's, Public Works is supposed to take care of the stones, and Todd and I were talking about it, we may send a letter saying, can you guys be more careful with your lawnmowers in the future, so.
But if there's vandalism, the family has to pay for it, I know.
And a lot
we
of
were
the
gone
families
away
don't
and
live
they-
here anymore. A lot of the families are gone.
We had to fix a couple of ours.
Yeah. But the city is responsible for the 3 inside the city limits. So if you have any questions about those cemeteries, you go to Public Works. St. Patrick's, you go over to St. Catherine's office. Loper and, well, Reed's Corner has its own association, and I did meet the secretary, but I don't know who is in charge. And I'm not sure who's in charge of Loper. So, but I know some towns out east, they have an association and the office is right there at the cemetery.
Well, thank you, Laura. Certainly want to commend you for the time you put in for preparing this. It's
2
very,
o'clock in the morning last week.
very worthwhile experience. And by the way, you know, we're going to adjourn right now, so Laura will be around here so you can ask some of
Yeah.
the other more pointed questions that you
And I'll
have
leave
to
my
get-
computer up, because I've got other pictures of different ones in here, so.
All right. Sergeant Benson, would you like to describe to them procedures for what we're going to do next?
Well, we're gonna take the chairs
Well, the
away and then
walk-
we're gonna set up the tables
walking
so that we can
part
have
that I
our
did
chili.
4.5 years.
Right.
Dinner.
Don't leave because we put the tables
But
up.
it's the
It's
program
not
itself,
over.
actually.
So we'll move the chairs and then just put